Hi, everybody. We're back. This is Chris, and I have Matt with me as well to our yet to be named legal regulatory video series. We really appreciate everybody tuning into this one. We hope you really enjoyed the first video we did. So Matt and I had such a good time. We decided to do another one, this time a little more focused. Today, we're going to talk about market entry. So what a regulated or maybe non-regulated communication service provider needs to know when they're entering the EU or if they're entering the markets in the United States. So hopefully we're going to kind of get into just some of the big picture stuff new market entrants should be thinking of when they're kind of launching services or getting ready to launch services in both these jurisdictions or globally as well. Again, as always, subscribe. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Matt and I, either through LinkedIn or through one of the other various channels that we have. We'd love to hear from you, especially if there are any questions or comments or suggestions, or even new topics you want us to cover. So Matt, tell us, I guess, start off, just tell us a little bit about kind of what to expect when a company is entering the market in the EU. I know there's different member states. I know the island that you're on, Great Britain, is not part of the EU. So what are some considerations, both from a licensing standpoint and also from a just regulatory standpoint that people need to be aware of?
Definitely. So focusing on the EU, it's probably a timely chat that we're having because there's been quite a lot of movement in this space, particularly in the EU. UK, not as much, but in January this year, the Commission proposed the Digital Networks Act, which we touched on very briefly in our first chat. Hoping to implement that by Q4 of 27. It's a root and stem pull out of the existing law, which is the European Electronic Communication. It will maintain some elements of that. It'll be familiar to entities who are already operating in the EU, for example, around general authorization conditions. Those are the conditions that attach to your registration when you enter into a market. But it has some interesting changes to the EECC. One of the big ones, which is still quite contentious, I will be interested to see whether it's got legs, because I think it will be very political, is this concept of the single passport. You and I might recall from our time working together under the existing regime, under the EECC, every country has its flavor of regulation. EECC was a directive, which meant that it was implemented at every member state's national level. And so there was some changes, not just around the periphery, but I would say even to a degree, some gold plating from country to country. And so the registration and market entry requirements are very different. It was meant to standardize market entry. I think the EU have tacitly acknowledged in the Digital Networks Act didn't really work very well. And so now they're taking this more belts and braces approach. The DNA is actually a regulation and act, so it had binding authority verbatim in terms of its text. In terms of what this single passport does, and where it differs considerably from the EECC, if you're an entity coming in to the market, let's say you're a communications network or you are a communications service provider, as the draft stands, you now have the ability to designate your home market. You can pick a regulatory authority that might want to register with, and you need to do it just the once. And that will satisfy your EU-wide level. Yeah, it's huge. Now, the reason I said this might be fraught with politics is because whilst we're all one happy European nation, the reality is that there is friction at different member state levels. Different member states treat compliance in different ways, and they have understandably national security concerns around that. This gives discretion to the operator, unlike or the GDPR, which we discussed a little bit in the last call as well, where you have this main establishment concept. Currently, the DNA does not have that. So you're completely at your discretion,
so
which is really interesting.
Could you find an easy country? Is there going to be an easy country? Like in the US, everybody registers their company in Delaware. It's not easy. There's reasons for it, but is everybody going to go to, say, Italy or south of France?
I strongly doubt that everyone's going to go to Italy.
Yeah, true.
Based on my personal experience.
Nice places, all vacations.
Absolutely. So herein lies the issue, right? You've touched on really the live wire. And whether this survives the proposal or not, we'll see. But there are different levels of compliance and there are different pro-business regulators out there. Certainly, if you look at the history of the GDPR and the entities from the US that had to register there, Ireland became an obvious choice.
Right.
Ireland has a fairly robust, consistent legal system, an engaging regulator. It's an English first jurisdiction, so obviously that's a lot easier. And certainly administratively, when I compare, say, the Irish system to Italy, Poland, some more of the Southern European member states, it's dramatically simpler to there. For that reason, you might see companies favoring a country like Ireland over Italy, which has a high admin burden,
right,
fairly aggressive regulator. Similarly, though, for that reason, it's not beyond the realm of possibility to see someone in Italy saying, well, hang on, if you're doing operations in Italy and you're registering in Ireland, how is that in any way in the spirit of the DNA?
Yeah.
So it'll be very interesting. There have been other commentators out there who very rightly said the law is not going to change the ability of member states to enforce in their own jurisdictions. I think the DNA is intended to streamline and coordinate much more than the communications code. Definitely, if you look at the explanatory notes to the law, it talks about obtaining your registration in your designated country, complying with the general authorization requirements in that country, and those requirements being standardized across the board. So I think the Commission intends that people in the market have the same set of rules.
Right.
Whether that lands with local regulators, national authorities, is yet to be seen. The fact that they're taking significant steps, they're using a regulation as opposed to a directive, suggests they're going to hold very firm on this issue. So I think if you're coming into the market, this is a real improvement on the current situation. And I think it presents some opportunities and potentially even some restructuring opportunities if you're in the market currently.
Yeah. So once you enter the market, what types of compliance obligations should you be aware of? Are there fees, taxes, kind of network obligations that you need to be aware of after you've become a regulated telecom entity?
Certainly from the perspective of taxes, not so much. So the model here doesn't tax the services that you provide. Depending on the scale of your operations, you may need to contribute to universal funds, which are used to administer the scheme in whichever member state you're in. That's usually a volume-based question. And your contribution is usually tied to a threshold. So however much turnover you produce dictates the amount you contribute to the universal fund in your country. The third point you mentioned, network obligations, yes, is the answer. So there are broad standard obligations. They're called the general authorization conditions. They should apply in theory, whichever country you're in. And that is going to include elements of cybersecurity, emergency calling, call porting, call line ID requirements, connection requirements for networks.
Interesting.
It's going to include oversight measures as well. Probably one call out maybe from the DNA, which is a new requirement. So an additional burden for entities entering the market is supply chain coordination and supervision.
Oh, interesting.
So that wasn't previously called out specifically. It was always, I think, implied as a threat vector from the cybersecurity. The DNA has actually now said, no, we have some prescriptive standards that you're going to need to apply as regards your supply chain. And this isn't, I'd be interested to get your point on this. I don't think it's similar to the US, where you have high-risk vendors, for example, Huawei, those sorts of entities.
Yeah, it is different than the US because at least in terms of cybersecurity, there are specific frameworks, especially if you're contracting with the government, or if you are in some kind of critical infrastructure. That's where you really get a lot of the supply chain management. There's no broad supply chain management requirements, but one of the big things, and I'm not sure if you have in the EU right now, but robocall mitigation is a huge topic at the federal level. So one of the things that I think a lot of companies, both in the US, entering the US, have to really be aware of is the very expansive robocall mitigation regulations that are getting imposed. And a lot of that is know your customer. So that really does impact both your customers and your supply chain. So there's really an emphasis right now on of making sure everybody within the call path is known, is not making fraudulent calls. And really they're putting a huge burden on the carriers to enforce some sort of policing of the actors of the calls.
Yep.
And the know your customer regulations are getting much more stringent as time goes on. So at first it was, I don't want to say voluntary, but less of a standard. And within even the last year, there have been prescriptive standards that just keep getting imposed of what information you have to ask for, what documentation you have to get from your customers. So that kind of touches on the supply chain, there, but that is one of the big areas in the US that I think a lot of, especially foreign carriers, have to be very aware of.
And I think another area where there's probably a significant difference for our US audience.
Yeah.
So something that was introduced under the existing law, the communications code, is this concept of a number-based and a number-independent interpersonal communication service.
So what's that?
WhatsApp would be examples as a number-independent interpersonal communication service. It's not necessarily provided for a fee, so I'm not in the scope. But certainly the idea was, even under the existing law, those entities should be regulated in some ways. They're not necessarily regulated in the same way as a traditional network or a number. So they don't attract pure registration requirements under the existing law or under the new law, as we might get to in a little moment. That doesn't mean there's absolutely no registrations involved. There is still the matter of cybersecurity, which casts a broader blanket than telco law. But one area the new law is going to change will be in terms of networks. What would you say non-traditional networks, not really for a telco purpose? The DNA is introducing this concept of a communications network used primarily to support public-facing internet sharing society applications. Those are slightly confusing terms. What it means and what they're tackling in broad terms are the digital world. So we're talking e-commerce platforms, content providers, Netflix, your Amazons, social media, really the gamut, any sort of service that is offered to the public, digital service over the internet for a fee. The networks underpinning those services are now going to attract these telco-like obligations, which is quite a change. Whilst it falls under the concept of, we think of telco law, it really is digital networks. It's beyond telco now. So if you're operating a network to support those sort of public-facing apps, all of a sudden you've now got these compliance obligations that are analogous to a telco. So that's one other really big change, particularly from a registration perspective. It just didn't exist under current law. That's really new.
No, there's nothing equivalent to that in the US. Really, most of the regulations kind of fall on, I guess, your communication service providers. And really, there has been a big push in the US, especially with a lot of the your anti-net neutrality or net neutrality, to separate out the internet component. And that's, I don't want to say largely unregulated, but it's definitely a light touch, where if you're just providing an internet connection, you don't have the onerous registration requirements, fee payment requirements. But as soon as you start providing any type of communication service, or even some data transmission services, that's when you really enter into the regulatory landscape, both at the FCC level and then at the state level in the US. And that's one of the other things I just kind of wanted to touch on briefly was, if in the US, one of the big differences is that there is the federal level. So that's the FCC here. And there are market entry, registration requirements there, fee payment obligations. So there's a very high regulatory threshold for communication providers at the federal level. And then we have obviously 50 states in the US, and each of those has their own regulatory commission, a public utility commission or similar, that also imposes market entry requirements, registration requirements, fee payment requirements. So it's a two-tier system that you really have to be mindful of when you enter the US. There's also, which I deal with as well, state tax obligations. So each state has its own taxes. There's certain other regulatory fees, 911 administrators. So when I hear you talking about cleaning up telecom, I'm like, That sounds like a great idea.
You're right. It's not easy anywhere. And I think you do need to know someone on the ground
Yeah.
who has that experience and can talk to that. I always find it perplexing. I hear about the state level regime. But
Oh yeah, yeah. And each one's different. I think what's interesting about it is each one has its own unique. California is much different than Alabama, and you have to be very mindful. One of the complexities also is kind of knowing which states have a higher threshold of
yeah,
tolerance. Like California, you need to register before you even have one call on your network, or they will
exactly.
highly police you. And there's a register there's a registration requirement in most states, although some states are a lot more light touch. Some
Yep.
don't regulate services like MVNOs or VoIP services, and it really is important to know those differences before you take on your customers, build out your network, really have a good picture of kind of where you're
Yep.
going and have a solid foundation there.
One more point you made just then, which I
Yeah.
think is probably worth calling out, maybe a little bit different to certainly if you're coming even from Australian background or a US background, or if you're from the Middle East. So it's not a licensing regime here. You're not precluded from providing the service until you obtain a
Interesting.
license. You register and proceed. In some countries, they have actually foregone registration requirement altogether. France and Denmark are two examples of that.
Wow.
So it is much lighter touch.
Yeah.
Certainly when you're working in the Middle East, where it's a much more controlled telco environment, there's a licensing element to it. You actually have to be
Yeah.
explicitly authorized to do what you want to do. But that is one of the attractive things, and maybe one of the differences I've noticed between the US and as well, and the UK for that matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on that note, does the UK now differ from the EU? Is there a bifurcation since you guys left?
Yeah.
Or you guys, but
Yeah, there is. No, I became British earlier this
yeah.
year, so I can say it's us guys. Yeah, there is. So the UK did adopt the current European law, the Communications Code, prior to Brexit broadly. It didn't actually take this concept of a number independent interpersonal communication service, maybe because it felt it didn't need it, but it did take the concept of a number-based interpersonal communication service. That's your classic VoIP provider. Skype, for example, which has breakouts of the PSTN. Those entities, the number-based ones, do still have registration requirements analogous to a proper telco, as they do in Europe. Where the DNA has moved on, I think the UK, the communications code is probably the last point of a parallel. I think you'll see the UK reviewing and possibly updating its telco laws. It has a broadly similar concept. They call them the general conditions of entitlement.
Right.
The UK doesn't require you to register either, but once you start providing a regulated service, number-based VoIP or a traditional telco service, if you're an ISP, then you are taken to comply with those conditions of entitlement. Whilst there's no registration, people can get caught out if they're not aware of the conditions of entitlement and they don't have good documentation around their compliance, for example.
So bigger question, what should people do if they're, say, a US company looking to enter the EU or the UK? What are some good steps to kind of get prepared for kind of market entry and compliance?
To give you the elevator pitch now, as it stands in July 2026, I would say the UK is not going to move so much. So be familiar with the existing regime, appreciating that it's a light touch regime. There are still some fairly important things you need to know around cybersecurity, network obligations, caller ID, emergency calling. If you get to a big enough volume of services in the UK, you also got to watch out. They have a very hefty telecommunications security regime. It does have a threshold test, but it's worth checking if you're going to come in at scale to know that as well. If you're looking at going into the EU, the advice may be a little different. I would say approach the DNA with a hint of caution. As we discussed, one, there is the capacity for it to change dramatically whilst it goes through the legislative process in the EU, and I can expect some pushback from some regulators. Two, as we saw with the abandonment of the e-privacy regulation, that was supposed to resolve a number of issues around the legacy e-privacy directive, which also applies to communication networks and services. It took, I think, 8 to 10 years, and they gave up. So
Wow.
where there is contention, time slows to a crawl. So I wouldn't put my plans off market entry now. It does mean that the current law applies, and that does mean that you are looking at a market by market entry requirement. But then with careful analysis, if you are an over-the-top provider or a number-based interpersonal service, not a traditional telco, there may be ways around that. So working with council, designing your products cleverly and within the bounds of the definitions can save you a lot of hassle.
Yeah.
Equally, look, the conditions for operating in the EU are not going to change dramatically for most providers. So if you are keen to come in, we can help you with that. And the work that you do now is going to carry over under the new regime as well. So there's no reason not to join or to enter a new market in the EU, I think.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And I think for the US at least, it's similar. I think one of the real things that I'd like to emphasize with the US is really think about where your markets are going to be. Again, what states you're going to be in, really have a forward-looking plan. And that way you can start to anticipate, again, some of both the issues on the federal level of what type of customers you're going to have, what markets you're going to be serving, what your expected revenue is. One of the things that I know you said there's a universal service fund in the EU. There is a federal universal service fund in the US, but the thresholds are getting very low right now. So most providers end up having almost immediate payment obligations into it. And this is just a reaction to the percentage getting bigger and bigger. It's probably up to 30% right now. So that's one of the things that really providers really need to be aware of, is that there is a very high threshold for the Federal Universal Service Fund right now, which means that the payment obligations do ramp up very quickly. So that's something I think all providers really need to focus on and really anticipate when you're entering. And there are ways to minimize it. A lot of what I do is really looking at ways to classify services, ways to allocate services jurisdictionally, both between the federal level and the state level. And a lot of that will impact some of both the fee payment obligations and also the regulatory obligations overall. So there's a lot of kind of strategy that you really need to take into account as you're ramping up your services. The other thing I would say is also do look at which states you expect to be in, where those customers are going to be located, because that's going to have also an impact on licensing and registration out of the gate. Other than that, it's easy. But no, with the right professional, I think it is very manageable. And both of us have a lot of experience in these respective countries. We can minimize the challenges and the headaches.
Absolutely.
Yeah, perfect. Matt, thanks for joining us, or thanks everybody.
Log 2 down. Well done.
Really appreciate it. Again, please subscribe. Look forward to some other very, very interesting and fun videos. If anybody has any topics, again, that you want to hear about or cover, or just any general feedback, leave some comments or just reach out to us individually with any questions about anything. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Cheers, Chris.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, guys.